hierarchical order and suppress revolutionary impulses, sought to reconcile the principles of his youth with the realities of imperial governance. He aspired to cultivate in Russia what he termed paternal administration and Christian government, an ideal in which benevolence and strict authority were intertwined. The last decade of his reign, stretching from 1815 to 1825, foreshadowed the uncompromising absolutism of Nicholas I, whose iron hand would shape Russian political and social life for 3 decades and cast a shadow over Western Europe as a symbol of medieval rigidity. For the Jews of Russia, whose lives were intricately bound to the fortunes of the empire, these years held extraordinary significance. The Congress of Vienna, convened in the year 1815, redrew the political map of Europe and expanded the borders of the Russian Empire to encompass almost the entirety of the former Duchy of Warsaw. This territory, reorganized under Russian administration as the so-called Kingdom of Poland, brought nearly 2 million Jews under imperial rule along the western strip of the empire. This densely concentrated Jewish population became the object of every conceivable experiment, their lives and liberties intertwined with the shifting currents of Russian policy. The last years of Alexander I's reign inaugurated a complex period of simultaneous patronage and oppression, laying the groundwork for the even harsher policies that would follow. The approach of the Russian government toward the Jews during these years reflected a sequence of attitudes that would shape the next 40 years. In the period from 1815 to 1825, the government combined a form of benevolent paternalism with continuing legal and social restrictions. Under Nicholas I, from 1826 to 1840, the policy turned increasingly militaristic, enforcing conscription on Jewish youth from early childhood, imposing rigorous Baroque discipline, and mandating assimilation in religion, while simultaneously reinstating the severe legal disabilities of the past. Later, in the years 1840 to 1855, a so-called enlightened approach attempted to improve Jewish conditions through the establishment of crown schools and the dismantling of traditional communal structures, yet cruel restrictions and discriminatory laws remained firmly in place. This continuous experimentation, punctuated by the revival of ritual murder trials and large-scale expulsions in medieval fashion, cast a long and tragic shadow over the history of Russian Jewry. At the outset, however, the years immediately following the Vienna Congress did not appear entirely menacing. Emperor Alexander I returned from the negotiations in Vienna without overtly aggressive designs toward the Jewish population. On the contrary, he remembered the services rendered by Jews during the French invasion of Russia in the year 1812, when Jewish couriers, informants, and aides had risked life and limb to support the Russian war effort. He also recalled the promise he had made at Bruxelles, a small German town where he had been residing during the concluding years of the Napoleonic conflict, to improve the condition of his Jewish subjects. In practice, several administrative steps seemed to point toward improvement. The first of these steps was a series of departmental changes affecting the management of Jewish affairs. On the 18th day of January in the year 1817, an imperial ukase directed the Senate to transmit all matters concerning Jewish communes, excluding legal cases under ordinary judicial review, to the general manager of the spiritual affairs of foreign denominations. This post was held by Prince Golitsyn, a trusted associate of the Tsar, known for his deep interest in Christian pietism and mystical devotion. Later in the same year, the government combined the Ministry of Ecclesiastic Affairs with the Ministry of Public Instruction, creating a new body to oversee education and religious matters. Under Golitsyn's guidance, this ministry symbolized the imperial effort to base public instruction upon the principles of Christian piety. The charter of the new organization explicitly required that all Jewish matters in charge of the Senate and the ministers be transmitted to its head, effectively placing the Jewish question at the center of the ecclesiastical administration. The administrative shift was accompanied by a more substantial innovation. Recognizing the need for permanent advisory representation, the government established at the Ministry of Ecclesiastic Affairs a council composed of elected deputies from the Jewish communes. This development was inspired by earlier, albeit temporary, experiments with Jewish representation during the Napoleonic Wars, when 2 Jewish purveyors, Sundel Sonnenberg from Grodno and Lezer Dillon from Neswitz, had been attached to the headquarters of the Russian army in the year 1812. These deputies had maintained communication both with high-ranking imperial officials, conveying the wishes and needs of Jewish communities, and with local kahals, ensuring that their fellow Jews were kept informed of imperial intentions. At a personal audience with Alexander I, these deputies had received assurances that the condition of their co-religionists would be improved, and they were instructed to return to St. Petersburg after the conclusion of the war to relay the plans of the government to the Kahals. Through these measures, the seeds of a new system of Jewish representation were sown. The deputation of the Jewish people, as it came to be known, reflected a cautious attempt by the imperial administration to involve the Jewish population in the management of their own affairs, while simultaneously keeping them under the watchful eye of the state. Yet behind this apparent concession lurked the tension that would define the last years of Alexander I, the precarious balance between benevolence and control, between the promise of amelioration and the shadow of authoritarian oversight, casting a complex and dramatic frame around the lives of Russian Jewry in the early 19th century. The deputies accordingly appeared in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital that gleamed with power yet echoed with the secrets of bureaucracy, and they entered upon their duties as Jewish spokesmen. During the years 1816 and 1817, they spoke on behalf of a people whose voices had long been muffled by law, prejudice, and the crushing weight of history. Yet even as they stood in the corridors of power, they understood the limits of their position. They knew, with painful clarity, that they had no right to call themselves the accredited representatives of all the Jewish communities of Russia. It was this awareness that drove them back to the very communities that had elected them. They appealed to the government, and one man, Sonnenberg, was particularly active in pushing this appeal forward. They demanded that all the Kahals, the Jewish communal councils, be instructed to elect a complete group of deputies in proper form. The government, in a rare moment of bureaucratic agreement, accepted the proposal. A clause was added to the instructions of the newly established Ministry of Ecclesiastic Affairs, the government department responsible for overseeing religious matters. This clause stated that the names of the deputies of the Jewish communes shall, after their election, be submitted by the minister to His Majesty for ratification. In other words, the state would accept the Jewish deputies, but only as long as the emperor himself approved them. In the autumn of 1815, all the large Kahals received orders from the governors to choose an electoral college, 2 electors for each government. In August, 1818, the 22 electors chosen from 11 governments assembled in Vilna, the great Jewish center of Lithuania, to elect from their midst 3 deputies and an equal number of substitutes. The choice fell, apart from the former deputies Sonnenberg and Dillon, on Michael Eisenstadt, Benish Lapkovsky, and Marcus Vadelson, all from the government of Vitebsk, and Samuel Epstein from the government of Vilna. These men were not only leaders, they were symbols of hope, chosen to carry the burden of their people's aspirations into the heart of imperial power. But the deputies needed money. The war had ruined the Jewish communities, and they were not in a position to tax themselves directly. So the Vilna Conference issued an appeal to all Jewish communities. They called for an embroidery collection. Wealthier Jews were asked to cut off and convert into cash the embroidered collars attached to their kittels, the white shrouds worn beneath the prayer shawls on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. The less fortunate could donate money instead. The collection was not only a financial necessity, it was a symbol of sacrifice, a testimony to the willingness of a people to give what little they had for the sake of representation. Soon afterward, a special department was established to serve the deputation of the Jewish people, the name by which this College of Deputies was commonly known. The deputation, presided over by the energetic Sonnenberg, labored for 7 years, from 1818 to 1825. But their activity was limited, and it fell far short of the hopes that Russian Jewry had placed upon them. The deputies had hoped that they would be consulted on the general problems of Jewish life and the proposed amelioration of their conditions. Instead, the government had abandoned all thought of legislative reform. It even began to devise ways to enforce the restrictive clauses of the Statute of 1804, a law that had been suspended during the War of 1812. The deputies, living in St. Petersburg and constantly engaged in lobbying, often managed to uncover these secret plans. They would relay their findings discreetly to the Kahal leaders in the provinces, trying to warn them of the dangers that were being prepared in the imperial bureaucracy. At the same time, they attempted to avert disaster through personal negotiations with leading officials. In this dual role they became go-betweens, bridges between the Jewish communities and the state. They reported to the Kahals, and they transmitted petitions and complaints to Prince Galitzin, the Minister of Ecclesiastic Affairs. Yet this was not the role they had dreamed of. They had been appointed to represent, to advocate, to shape the future. Instead, they were reduced to messengers, to intermediaries who could only plead and warn. Some of them, like Sonnenberg, were indefatigable. They tried the patience of the high officials with endless petitions and representations. Their persistence, however, provoked resentment. On one occasion, Sonnenberg was deprived of his post for what was called impertinent conduct towards the authorities. The bureaucracy of St. Petersburg began to resent these constant solicitations and the interference with their plans. Gradually, the deputies lost heart. They realized their impotence in the face of a rising wave of reaction. Some left St. Petersburg altogether. The downfall of Golitsyn's Ministry of Ecclesiastic Affairs, undermined by the ultra-reactionary Arakcheyev party, led inevitably to the downfall of the Jewish representation attached to it. Golitsyn's successor, the Minister of Public Instruction, Shishkov, was an obscurantist, a man who distrusted reform and feared progress. He wrote to the emperor, urging the abolition of the institution of Jewish deputies. He argued that their presence was not only unnecessary but harmful, because they collected money from Jews, for no purpose, and prematurely disclosed government decisions and intentions. In 1825, the deputation of the Jewish people was abolished. And so ended an institution that had been beautifully conceived but badly executed. It might have served as a substitute for Jewish communal representation, and it might have softened the regime of caprice and patronage that gnawed deeper and deeper into the vitals of Russian politics. Instead, it became another symbol of the limitations placed upon a people who were allowed to speak, but not to be heard. The spirit of the new age that dawned over the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 19th century carried with it not only administrative reforms and humanitarian rhetoric, but also a fervent religious impulse. In the eyes of the ruling circles in St. Petersburg, concern for the Jews was no longer limited to their economic usefulness or social regulation. It now extended to what was believed to be the salvation of their souls. Christian Pietism, a deeply emotional and mystical form of religious devotion, had become fashionable among the elites of Europe, and nowhere more so than at the Russian court. Emperor Alexander I, born in the year 1777 and ruling since 1801, was personally inclined toward religious mysticism. At his side stood Prince Alexander Nikolaevich Golitsyn, the Minister of Ecclesiastic Affairs and Public Instruction, a man equally absorbed by visions of divine mission and spiritual transformation. Both men came to see themselves as chosen instruments of providence, called to guide the Jews of Russia out of what they regarded as spiritual darkness and into the light of Christianity. Golitsyn, who also served as president of the Russian Bible Society, sought to remodel that organization after its admired English prototype, the Missionary Bible Society of London, which combined Bible distribution with active evangelization. In this atmosphere of religious zeal, the so-called Jewish question acquired a new and ominous dimension. On the 25th day of March in the year 1817, Emperor Alexander I issued an imperial decree, known as a ukase, ordering the establishment of a new institution bearing the solemn title, the Society of Israelitish Christians. Its declared purpose was to assist Jews who had already converted to Christianity, as well as those preparing to take that step. The language of the decree was infused with religious pathos and paternal concern. It spoke of Jews who, by divine grace, had perceived the truth of Christianity and were ready to join what it called the flock of the Good Shepherd and Savior of souls. According to the imperial proclamation, these converts found themselves in a tragic and isolated position. Having accepted Christianity, they were cut off from their fellow Jews, stripped of all support from their former communities, and exposed, as the decree claimed, to hostility and persecution. At the same time, they remained strangers among Christians, not yet trusted or fully accepted by their new co-religionists. Moved, as the ukase declared, by compassion for their plight and by obedience to what it described as the divine call summoning the scattered sheep of Israel to the faith of Christ, the emperor announced that measures would be taken for their welfare. That promised welfare was not merely spiritual. It was tangible, material, and deliberately alluring. Groups of converted Jews were to receive free crown lands belonging to the state, both in the southern and northern provinces of the empire. They were granted the right to establish settlements of every kind, from villages and townlets to entire cities. They were to enjoy full civil equality, extensive rights of communal self-government, and special relief from the burden of taxation. Once baptized into one of the recognized Christian confessions, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Lutheran, these Jewish converts would be organized into colonies forming part of the Society of Israelitish Christians. The society itself was to be governed by a special committee appointed in St. Petersburg and placed under the direct patronage of the emperor. The solemn and expansive tone of the imperial decree left little doubt that the Russian government was not content with aiding a few isolated converts. It was preparing for a far-reaching enterprise. The goal was nothing less than to encourage baptism on a mass scale and to organize entire communities of converted Jews into privileged settlements. These communities were intended to serve as living examples and irresistible temptations to the millions of Jews who still clung to their ancestral faith. In the imagination of the lawmakers, vast numbers of Jews would be drawn toward Christianity, not only by the promise of eternal salvation, but also by the very earthly rewards of land, security, and civic equality. This missionary enthusiasm at the Russian court quickly attracted the attention of religious activists beyond the borders of the empire. Among them was Louis Way, a prominent representative of the London Bible Society, an organization devoted to spreading Christianity and distributing the scriptures throughout the world. Way was deeply influenced by apocalyptic beliefs, convinced that the redemption of Israel and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy were near at hand and would unfold under the banner of Christianity. Yet, unlike many missionaries of his time, he regarded the Jewish people with a mixture of reverence and urgency. To him, unconverted Israel was not merely a target of conversion, but the bearer of a profound divine mission in human history. Louis Way had traveled extensively through the lands of Poland and neighboring regions, observing Jewish life at close quarters. These journeys filled him with indignation at the civil disabilities and legal humiliations imposed upon Jews across Europe. When, in the autumn of the year 1818, the monarchs of Europe who had formed the Holy Alliance gathered with their ministers and diplomats at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, a city in western Germany, Way seized the opportunity. He presented Emperor Alexander I with a detailed document entitled Memorandum Concerning the Condition of the Jews. In this memorandum, Way appealed passionately to the Russian emperor to emancipate the Jews within his dominions and to use his moral authority to persuade the rulers of Prussia and Austria to do the same. Drawing upon both religious conviction and political reasoning, he argued that Providence had deliberately placed vast numbers of Jews under the rule of 3 Christian sovereigns. This, he claimed, was not an accident of history, but a fulfillment of the ancient promises made to the biblical patriarchs. If the Jews were ever to join the Christian faith, Way insisted, they must first be treated with dignity. They must be regarded as equal members of human society, not as pariahs or outcasts. Material liberation, he argued, was a necessary precondition for spiritual transformation. Israel, long held captive by legal restrictions and social exclusion, had to be freed in the worldly sense before it could be redeemed in the religious one. With this conviction, Louis Way implored Emperor Alexander I to set a bold example, confident that such an act would reverberate throughout Europe and influence the entire world. The memorandum prepared by Way, a detailed appeal for the civil emancipation of the Jews across Europe, found its way into the hands of Emperor Alexander I, who promptly turned it over to Karl Robert von Nesselrode, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Empire. The emperor instructed Nesselrode to submit the document to the Congress then in session, a grand assembly of plenipotentiary ministers representing the great powers of Russia, Austria, Prussia, England, and France. On the 21st day of November in the year 1818, these diplomats convened to discuss Way's memorandum, along with his printed and painstakingly prepared project proposing a pan-European reform of civil and political legislation affecting Jewish populations. Yet the ministers, representing governments more concerned with dynastic interests than human rights, had little desire to entangle themselves in what they considered a domestic problem, one belonging to the internal administration of each empire. After discussion, they reached a resolution, carefully crafted to sound progressive while committing them to nothing at all. Without touching upon the substance of Way's proposals, they acknowledged the general justice of his intentions and noted that the plenipotentiaries of Austria and Prussia, Prince Clemens von Metternich and Prince Karl August von Hardenberg, statesmen renowned for their conservative and reactionary diplomacy, had promised to provide information on the situation of Jews in their realms, ostensibly to clarify a problem that demanded the attention of both statesmen and humanitarians. In truth, this liberal-sounding phrase allowed the diplomats to shed the vexation of the Jewish question entirely. The perfunctory discussion of Way's project was prompted only by deference to the Russian emperor, and each of the three powers that had divided Poland among themselves continued to administer the Jewish population according to the strict and reactionary requirements of their own domestic policies, disguising no part of their intentions with the false veil of humanitarianism. In Russia, the emperor's policy mirrored this inertia. While abroad he had listened with courteous attention to Way's appeal for the civil emancipation of Jews, in domestic practice, Alexander I left everything untouched. He pinned his hopes for resolving the Jewish problem on the implausible endeavors of the so-called Society of Israelitish Christians, an organization dedicated to promoting the conversion of Jews to Orthodox Christianity. Despite the solemn imperial appeal of the year 1817, no organized groups of converts had come into existence over the subsequent 3 years, except for rare and often suspect individual baptisms. Undeterred, the government, in the year 1820, set aside a large tract of land in the government of Yekaterinoslav, an area in southeastern Ukraine, named in honor of Empress Catherine the Great, for a projected settlement of these Israelitish Christians. A special official, granted the title of curator, was appointed to administer the land and oversee the prospective settlers. Yet year after year passed. The land lay empty, and the curator, despite his authority, could find no settlers to inhabit it. Finally, in the year 1823, a small and obscure group appeared from the port city of Odessa, numbering 37 families who professed the Greek Orthodox faith and expressed a willingness to accept the free land, along with all attendant rights and privileges. Upon inquiry, however, officials discovered that these claimants lacked certificates of baptism and could not produce proper passports. Consequently, the application was denied, and the settlement project collapsed. Recognizing the absurdity of the undertaking, Count Nikolai Borisovich Golitsyn, a trusted advisor to Alexander I, recommended in the year 1824 that the Society of Israelitish Christians be dissolved. The Tsar, however, refused to officially terminate the society, which by then maintained a roster of trustees and a cadre of government officials on its payroll despite having no real members. The society lingered in bureaucratic limbo until the year 1833, when Emperor Nicholas I, successor to Alexander I, issued a decisive ukase, abruptly ending this phantom institution. Nicholas I had, by then, devised more practical and far-reaching methods to force Jewish integration into the Orthodox Church, most notoriously through the use of military barracks and the institution of cantonists, Jewish boys conscripted for long terms of military service and systematic religious indoctrination. While the imperial authorities obsessed over the imagined conversion of the Jewish population, their attention was unexpectedly drawn to an alarming and ironic development. Large numbers of Christian communities were embracing practices and doctrines that closely resembled Judaism. Officials uncovered sects of Sabbatarians and Judaizers in the governments of Voronezh, Saratov, and Tula, regions where no Jewish population resided, to justify missionary influence. These groups, composed entirely of ethnic Russian Christians, had adopted Jewish customs and laws, sparking consternation among government authorities. The presence of these Judaizing sects posed a new and unforeseen challenge. The empire's obsession with converting Jews now had to contend with Christians who were voluntarily turning toward Jewish observance, a spectacle that unsettled the bureaucratic imagination and underscored the unpredictable consequences of religious zeal in the Russian Empire. In the year 1817, the Russian imperial government first turned its anxious gaze toward a new religious movement, one that came to be known as the Judaizing heresy. Its origins lay not among foreign agitators or rebellious nobles, but among humble Russian peasants. In the region surrounding the city of Voronezh, a group of villagers sent a petition directly to Emperor Alexander I, describing with innocent candor the oppressions which they had to undergo at the hands of the local authorities, both ecclesiastic and civil, on account of their confessing the law of Moses. The language was naive, yet the implications were profound. In the eyes of the state, adherence to Jewish law, even by ethnically Russian peasants, could be construed as dangerous, subversive, and in need of suppression. Acting under imperial instructions, Prince Golitsyn, the head of the newly organized Ministry of Ecclesiastic Affairs, ordered that the origins of the sect be examined most rigorously, with the goal of preventing its spread and restoring the adherents to the fold of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Greek Orthodox Archbishop of Voronezh submitted a report to the imperial authorities that conveyed both alarm and meticulous detail. According to his account, the sect had emerged around the year 1796, born through natural Jews, by which he meant that its initial inspiration came from Jewish practices observed or studied by local Russian Christians. From that modest beginning, the movement had spread to several settlements in the districts of Bobrov and Pavlovsk. The sect's practices, while not constituting a full return to Old Testament worship, included observances that were unmistakably drawn from Jewish ritual: the keeping of the Sabbath, circumcision, the regulation of marriages and divorces according to their own rules, the burial of the dead in a manner foreign to Orthodox custom, and the holding of private prayer assemblies. The number of adherents openly professing this heretical faith was estimated at 1,500 souls, male and female, though it was suspected that the number of secret followers was far greater. To eradicate the movement, the Archbishop recommended drastic measures. These included the deportation of Anton Rogov, a soldier who had become an active propagandist of the sect, and coordinated efforts by both church authorities and the secular police. Similar reports soon arrived from other regions of central Russia: Tula, Orlov, Saratov, and neighboring districts, each recounting the spread of the Judaizing movement, which appealed not only to peasants but to merchants and townsfolk alike. The sectarians consistently claimed that their motivation was a return to the faith of their forefathers, the Judeans, a claim that only heightened the anxiety of the Orthodox authorities. Alarmed by the rapid expansion of this movement, the central government resolved to take extraordinary measures. In the year 1823, the Committee of Ministers approved a severe plan put forward by Count Viktor Pavlovich Kochubey, the Minister of the Interior. According to this plan, the leaders and teachers of the Judaizing sect were to be conscripted into military service, while those unfit for such duty were to be deported to the remote and harsh regions of Siberia. All Jews were to be expelled from districts where the Sabbatarian or Judean sect had appeared. Any contact between Orthodox Christians and the sectarians was to be prevented, and the outward display of the sect, such as prayer assemblies or ceremonies not resembling Christian practices, was to be strictly forbidden. To intensify public contempt, instructions were given to identify the Sabbatarians as Jews, zhyds, as the term was used in contemporary Russian parlance, in order to provoke disgust and to emphasize the state's perception of the sect as alien and subversive. These measures were sanctioned personally by Emperor Alexander I in the months of February and September in the year 1825, mere weeks before the end of his reign. The consequences, though not fully realized until the subsequent reign, were tragic. Entire villages were depopulated or laid waste, thousands of sectarians were exiled to the harsh climates of Siberia and the Caucasus Mountains, and many of those who survived were forced to recant publicly, returning outwardly to orthodoxy while secretly clinging to their Judaizing beliefs. For the Jewish population of Russia, the immediate effects were limited. The number of Jews present in the affected central Russian provinces, those under the jurisdiction of Tula, Orlov, Saratov, and Voronezh, was minimal, as legal restrictions had confined most Jews to the western regions of the empire. Yet the Judaizing movement had broader consequences. Its existence irritated the religiously sensitive circles of St. Petersburg, who could not tolerate the phenomenon of Orthodox Christians gravitating toward the customs and practices of Jews. While imperial authorities prepared colonies and settlements for Jewish inhabitants, many villages in central Russia were emptied under suspicion of Judaizing tendencies. In this way, the movement, small in numbers but large in symbolic threat, indirectly intensified the precariousness of Jewish life, demonstrating how even the faintest brush with deviation from the prescribed religious order could provoke state intervention, exile, and social censure. The drama of these years, of peasants secretly observing the Sabbath, of soldiers like Anton Rogov punished for religious conviction, of entire settlements uprooted under the aegis of imperial law, illustrates the tension between faith, identity, and authority. It also marks the beginning of a period in which Russian Jews would find themselves continually caught between their own traditions and the vigilant, often brutal oversight of a state determined to control not only their lives but the very spiritual inclinations of the population around them. In the mind of Prince Golitsyn, the Minister of Ecclesiastic Affairs, a dangerous idea began to take root. He came to believe, as did many in the official circles of St. Petersburg, that the Jews were not merely a tolerated minority but a group bound by their religious laws to convert others to their faith. This belief was not grounded in fact, but it served a political purpose. It created a moral justification for repression, a way to frame cruelty as duty. And so, in the final years of the reign of Alexander I, the emperor who had once seemed a symbol of enlightened reform, Russia witnessed a renewed wave of religious oppression. At times this oppression swelled into the terrifying scale of wholesale persecution. It was this climate of suspicion that gave rise to an old, medieval prohibition. Jews were forbidden from keeping Christian domestic servants. The prohibition was suggested by Golitsyn himself, a man who otherwise did not fit the profile of an anti-Semitic zealot. Yet he was convinced by the idea of Jewish proselytism, and his reasoning was codified in the senatorial ukase of April 22, 1820. An ukase was a decree issued by the Tsar, a command that carried the force of law. The Senate justified this decree by pointing to examples of alleged Judaizing, the adoption of Jewish customs by Christians. They cited a movement in the government of Voronezh, a province in southern Russia, and the report of the governor of Kherson, another southern province, about Christian servants in Jewish homes who had begun to follow Jewish rituals. These examples were presented as evidence that Jews were actively trying to convert Christians, and thus the ban was framed as a necessary protection. But the repression did not stop there. The government's long-standing project of removing Jews from the villages gained renewed momentum. New restrictions were imposed on Jewish leasing of manorial estates, those large landed properties owned by the nobles. In the years 1819 and onward, ukases ordered local authorities to prosecute all so-called krestensia contracts. These were agreements in which a squire leased the harvest of a given year to a Jew. In exchange, the Jew was allowed to employ peasants to gather grain and hay and perform other agricultural labor. The government viewed these contracts as a criminal encroachment on the nobles' right to own peasants, who were treated as serfs, a form of slavery. In the eyes of the authorities, only the nobles had the prerogative of exploiting peasant labor. Therefore, all such farm leases were to be taken away from Jews, regardless of the ruin this caused. Jewish lessees, stripped of their livelihoods, were left to settle their accounts with the squires, often in despair and destitution. At the same time, the government revived its long-held ambition, the expulsion of Jews from the villages and hamlets. This had already been ordered by the Statute of 1804 but had been suspended when the cruelty of the measure became undeniable. The expulsion would have spelled ruin for tens of thousands of Jewish families, tearing them from homes they had lived in for generations. Yet the memory of the arguments made in 1812, when the Jewish Committee had successfully convinced the government that such a mass migration was impractical, was wiped clean. The authorities, both local and central, returned to the offensive. The methods used in the earlier campaigns were revived. When, in 1821, White Russia was struck by famine, the suffering did not spare the Jews. The local nobility, however, was quick to find a scapegoat. They blamed Jewish tenants and saloon keepers for the ruin of the peasantry. The landlords demanded that the government expel all Jews from the province or at least forbid them from selling spirits in rural settlements, claiming that Jews led the peasants into ruin. Local authorities echoed this view in response to an inquiry from Senator Baranov, who had been sent from St. Petersburg to investigate. The issue was brought before the committee charged with relief for the governments of White Russia. This committee included several ministers, among them the powerful Arakchayev, a man known for his reactionary influence. The Relief Committee approved the nobility's restrictive proposal, and soon the Committee of Ministers did the same. The result was a harsh ukase issued by the Tsar on April 11, 1823, addressed to the governors of White Russia. The decree had two parts. First, it forbade Jews in all settlements of the governments of Mogilev and Vitebsk from holding land leases, from keeping public houses, saloons, and hostels, and even from living in these villages. All such farming contracts were to become null and void by January 1, 1824. Second, it ordered the transplantation of all Jews in these two governments from rural settlements into the cities and towns by January 1, 1825. In signing this decree, Alexander I spoke of compassion. He gave verbal instructions to the Committee of Ministers to help the Jewish people find employment and sources of livelihood in their new places of residence. But no plan, no matter how well intended, could soften the blow of forced expulsion. Families were torn from their ancestral homes, reduced to beggary and vagrancy, cast into a future of uncertainty. As soon as the ukase reached the local authorities, they set to work with relentless cruelty. The machinery of the state, once again, turned against the vulnerable, and the Jewish communities braced themselves for a new wave of suffering. By the first month of the year 1824, the Russian countryside had been transformed into a scene of human suffering and despair. Over 20,000 Jews, men, women, and children alike, had been forcibly removed from the villages of the two western provinces, driven from their ancestral homes by imperial decree. Fleeing the countryside, they poured into the already overcrowded towns and small municipalities. In these towns, the streets were clogged with desperate refugees, stripped almost to their shirts, carrying the few possessions they had managed to salvage. Families were crammed together in appalling conditions, with as many as 10 people forced into a single room. Synagogues, the sacred houses of worship, were pressed into service as makeshift dormitories, while countless families, finding no shelter at all, huddled together in the biting winter cold. Disease spread rapidly among the displaced, and mortality rose sharply. In the city of Nivelle, sickness took a particularly cruel toll. Even the notoriously anti-Jewish Governor-General Prince Alexander Kovensky, who was touring the affected districts, was moved by what he saw. He recommended to the Committee of Ministers that the expulsions be halted, yet the damage had already been done. By the beginning of the year 1825, the majority of rural Jews had been uprooted, cast out into an uncertain and hostile world. The question inevitably arose, had such a human catastrophe served the interests of the empire? The answer came, painfully, 12 years later. In the year 1835, the Council of State admitted that the policy had failed. As far as White Russia, the lands roughly corresponding to modern Belarus, was concerned, the Council reported that experience had entirely contradicted the expectations that had motivated the expulsion. The Jews had been ruined, indeed, but the peasant population had derived no measurable benefit from the destruction of their neighbors' livelihoods. The human tragedy of White Russia, with its wholesale displacement, was nothing more than a prelude to further legal campaigns against the Jewish population. Almost simultaneously with the issuance of the expulsion ukase, on the first day of May in the year 1823, the emperor issued another decree calling for the creation of a new governmental body, the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews. This committee brought together some of the highest officials of the empire, including the ministers of Interior, Finance, Justice, Ecclesiastic Affairs, and Public Instruction. Its publicly declared mission was expansive and deceptively benevolent, to examine all the laws affecting Jews, to find ways to make their lives more comfortable and productive, to define their obligations to the state, and, in a single phrase, to indicate everything that could contribute to the amelioration of their civil status. Yet behind the polite language lay a darker purpose. In a frank admission made 6 years later, in a report of the Committee of Ministers in the year 1829, it was revealed that from the very beginning, the committee had been instructed to explore ways of reducing the Jewish population of the empire. The amelioration of the civil status of the Jews, as it turned out, was a euphemism for their systematic reduction and containment. Although the committee had been asked to conclude its work by the beginning of the year 1824, the full extent of its reactionary designs did not become evident until the reign of the next emperor. Meanwhile, the legal apparatus of the state did not remain idle. The process of restricting Jewish settlement and compressing the boundaries of their habitation continued unabated. To secure the western frontier of the empire against smuggling, Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich, administrator of the Kingdom of Poland and younger brother of Emperor Alexander I, recommended the removal of Jews from the borderlands. 2 imperial decrees, issued in the year 1825, ordered that all Jews living outside cities within 50 versts, a Russian unit of distance roughly equal to 3/4 of a mile, from the frontier be expelled, with the exception of those owning immovable property. Once again, human beings were forcibly torn from the homes where generations had lived, even though a rational policy could have been satisfied with stricter supervision along the border. To prevent what the authorities termed the undesirable multiplication of Jews in the frontier provinces, Jews from neighboring countries, particularly from the Austrian Empire, were forbidden to settle in Russia in the year 1824. Meanwhile, interior provinces of the empire, where Jews were only permitted temporary residence, required Jewish residents to produce gubernatorial passports, much like foreigners. Every aspect of their life was monitored and regulated, preventing them from establishing roots. Even the emperor himself occasionally intervened directly in these matters. On his last journey from St. Petersburg to southern Russia in the month of September in the year 1825, Emperor Alexander I observed a Jewish family living in a small village near the town of Luga. The family was engaged in tinplate work, a modest artisanal trade, yet their presence struck the emperor as irregular. He demanded to know on what ground they were residing there. The governor of St. Petersburg, alarmed by the imperial inquiry, immediately ordered the family's deportation from the district. He censured the local ispravnik, the rural police official responsible for law enforcement, and instructed the gubernatorial authorities to ensure that the strict rules regarding Jewish settlement were observed without exception. In this cold, systematic manner, the Russian government wove a web of regulations and forced migrations, constricting Jewish life to tightly controlled spaces, while continually instilling fear of expulsion and surveillance. The villages emptied of Jewish inhabitants, the towns overflowed with destitute refugees, and yet the machinery of state persisted, confident that order would emerge from suffering, even as human misery unfolded across the empire. Such was the stance of the Russian government toward the Jews, rigid, distant, and indifferent, but the question remained, what was the attitude of the Russian people themselves? In the early 19th century, the age in which public opinion could barely voice itself even in political literature, this question might have seemed impossible to answer. Yet the revolutionary stirrings of the Decembrists, a group of army officers and nobles who, in December of the year 1825, would attempt an uprising to impose constitutional reform, illuminated the mindset of the most progressive elements of Russian society. When it came to Jews, the picture that emerged was far from friendly. It revealed a deep estrangement in language, manners, and culture, a gulf so wide that it bred suspicion, resentment, and hostility. The typical Russian knew no more of the secluded life of Jews than he did of the customs of the distant Chinese. Even the educated Russian, who might have sought understanding, regarded Jewish practices with suspicion. The exclusiveness of patriarchal Jewish life, the cryptic rituals that surrounded it, the rigorism of the rabbis, the ecstatic devotion of the Tzaddiks, those mystical spiritual leaders revered in Hasidic communities, and the intense emotionalism of the Hasidic masses were all sources of bewilderment. If one turned to books for explanation, one found only the hackneyed phrases of German and Polish pamphlets, describing the Jews as fanatics, a state within a state, separate and threatening. The Decembrists' own writings reflect this conventional view of an age of reaction. In his revolutionary treatise, The Russian Truth, Pavel Ivanovich Pestel, a leading member of the Southern Society of Decembrists, devoted an entire chapter to the tribes populating Russia, in which he portrayed the Jewish question as a near-insoluble political tangle. Pestel enumerated the traits he considered peculiar to Jews, traits which, in his eyes, rendered them incompatible with the social order. He wrote that Jews foster among themselves incredibly close ties, maintaining a separate world, that their religion instills a belief that they are destined to dominate all nations, and that it makes it impossible for them to mix with any other nation. The rabbis, he claimed, exercised unlimited authority over the masses, binding the people spiritually, forbidding them to read any books except the Talmud and other sacred writings. Jews, Pestel warned, were fixated upon the coming of the Messiah, who would establish them in their kingdom, and therefore regarded themselves as temporary residents of the lands in which they lived. This, he argued, explained their passion for commerce and neglect of agriculture and handicrafts. Commerce alone, he added, could not sustain such vast numbers, and thus deceit and trickery were considered permissible, to the detriment of Christians. Pestel's perspective entirely overlooked the oppressive yoke imposed upon Jews by Russian law. He ignored the constraints of the Pale of Settlement, that restricted zone in western Russia where Jews were confined, and the brutal expulsions from villages that were occurring at the very time he wrote. He was blind to the complex web of legal disabilities that rendered the Jewish population the lowest rung of Russian society. Yet, from this distorted vantage, Pestel proposed remedies for the Jewish problem, addressed to the revolutionary government he envisioned, the so-called Supreme Provisional Administration. His first plan involved dismantling the injurious influence of close-knit Jewish communities, which he claimed kept Jews apart from other citizens. He suggested convening the most learned rabbis and the most intelligent Jews. Having evidently heard of Napoleon's Sanhedrin, the assembly convened in France to advise on Jewish affairs, listening to their counsel, and then adopting measures to eradicate Jewish exclusiveness. Pestel warned that, since Russia did not expel the Jews, they should be compelled to adopt a friendly attitude toward Christians. This approach, in essence, was a blueprint for forced assimilation, a stern, correctional, almost Austrian-style regime designed to crush Jewish cultural autonomy and enforce integration under the watchful eye of the state. The second, more radical alternative was an organized expulsion, to assist the Jews in forming a separate commonwealth in some portion of Asia Minor, the Ottoman territories in Anatolia. Pestel calculated that if all Russian and Polish Jews, numbering over 2 million, were concentrated in one place, they could overcome local obstacles, traverse the European territories of the Ottoman Empire, and establish a sovereign Jewish state. He favored this solution personally, though he acknowledged that its realization depended on circumstances and did not propose it as an obligatory policy for the Supreme Provisional Administration. Had the first plan been carried out, Pestel warned, Russian Jews would have received not civil equality but a rigid regulatory regime, a long string of correctional measures compelling assimilation, Russification, and the demolition of centuries-old cultural autonomy, while curbing their economic activities. The irony was sharp. Such a program would have replicated the very oppressive bureaucratic state against which the Decembrists themselves were planning to revolt. Not all Decembrists shared Pestel's perspective. Nikita Mikhailovich Muravyov, the leader of the Northern Society of Decembrists, initially drafted a constitution in which Jews would receive political rights only within the Pale of Settlement. In his later revisions, however, Muravyov replaced this restriction with the principle of full equality, signaling a more liberal and inclusive vision than that of his southern colleagues. In this tension between radical reaction, cautious reform, and the genuine desire for equality, the Decembrists' debates expose not only the limits of early 19th-century Russian understanding of Jewish life, but also the broader anxieties of a society on the brink of revolutionary upheaval. It was a world in which suspicion, estrangement, and ignorance could dictate policy, even among those who imagined themselves the champions of liberty. At the close of the first volume of this monumental chronicle, the reader is left with the resonant echoes of a century of upheaval, reform, and relentless experimentation in the life of Russian Jewry. The Lord Baltimore Press, situated in the bustling city of Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States of America, had brought this work to light, preserving the painstaking detail of a world in which imperial decrees, religious zeal, and social forces collided with profound human consequences. The footnotes scattered through the narrative offer both guidance and context. The lands of the former Duchy of Warsaw, integrated into the Russian Empire after the Vienna Congress of 1815, are referred to in Russian as Tsarstvo Polskoye, often translated as the Kingdom of Poland or Russian Poland. The statistics for the Jewish population of this period, though incomplete, indicate that some 2 million souls were concentrated along the western reaches of the Russian Empire, a population intensely observed by the authorities and subjected to relentless administrative experiments. The official census revisions carried out between 1816 and 1819 revealed glaring omissions, and the imperial government moved with severity against those who had evaded enumeration. By 1845, the German Jewish historian Joseph Jost estimated the total number of Jews, including those of the Kingdom of Poland, at approximately 1,600,000, though he acknowledged that the true figure was likely much higher. Within these turbulent decades, the imperial court in St. Petersburg witnessed the oscillation between paternal favor and strict oppression. Emperor Alexander I, returning from the Vienna Congress and aware of the loyalty displayed by Jewish communities during the campaign of 1812 against Napoleon Bonaparte, had promised at Bruxelles in Germany that the condition of his Jewish subjects would be ameliorated. Steps were taken, beginning with administrative reforms in 1817, to provide Jewish communities with channels for representation and to regulate their affairs under the supervision of Galitzin, a confidant of the Tsar and an advocate of Christian pietism and mystical devotion. The chronicles further reveal the presence of a vast network of extraordinary measures, extending from police inspections to ecclesiastical inquiries. Alexis Arakchayev, born in the year 1769, had become one of the most influential military figures under Emperors Paul and Alexander. Renowned for his iron discipline and unswerving loyalty, he gained the full confidence of Emperor Alexander by 1814, exerting a quiet but decisive influence until his death in the year 1834. Figures such as Count Victor Pavlovich Kochubey, ministers and senators, and army officers navigated a world in which the Jewish population was both a valuable economic presence and a potential instrument in imperial politics, all under the watchful eyes of the Tsar and his court. The meticulous recording of Hebrew, Greek, and Polish terms, as well as corrections to misprints and diacritics, reflects the painstaking care of the editors and transcribers, preserving the authenticity of the historical record. Small errors, such as the spelling of innkeepers or the proper rendering of Greek words for synagogues, have been corrected, ensuring that the narrative speaks with clarity and authority to the modern reader. Each note and amendment, whether restoring Israel or clarifying economic references, anchors the history in a world of real human struggle, governance, and cultural identity. Thus, the first volume concludes, not with resolution, but with the tension and anticipation that defined the lives of the Russian Jews under the sway of imperial power. The intricate interplay of law, religion, and social custom, set against the backdrop of wars, revolutions, and reforms, leaves the listener with a vivid impression of a people striving to preserve their faith, their culture, and their very existence amidst forces both paternal and oppressive. The stage is set for the subsequent volumes, where the experiments of the state, the resilience of the communities, and the unfolding tragedies and small triumphs of Russian Jewry will continue to reveal themselves in all their dramatic intensity.